Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Giulia D'Agnolo Vallan, and this is SI Harbor Cinema Conversation.
And our guest today is the great filmmaker, Michael Schultz. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Giulia. How are you?
I am very well. And it's, as I was saying, it's such an honor to have you. And especially because you're just about to start production on a TV series. And so it's a privilege to have that you've squeezed a little bit of time for us.
Oh.
I want to start, our audience knows you as a filmmaker, but your beginning really was in the theater. You were a stage director in New York, and you started with the Negro Ensemble Company in '67. Can you tell us a little bit about that part of your professional history?
Oh, sure. When I decided that this was the life I wanted to have, it came totally out of the blue. I was a sophomore in college. I had just decided that I was not going to be an astronautical engineer. I was not going to go to the moon. I didn't have enough in common with engineers and all of that. And I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I would spend half of my college time in this little movie theater watching Fellini and Zeffirelli and Lelouch and Kurosawa and all these great filmmakers. And I sat in the back saying, boy, I'd love to do that. I'd love to be able to tell stories like that are not Hollywood kind of stories, but real in-depth stories. Had no clue as to how to get started. Had no contacts in the entertainment world. There were no Black directors at the time. This is like 1962. And I couldn't afford to go to the 3 film schools that existed. There was NYU, USC, and UCLA, and that was basically it as far as film schools went. Couldn't afford to do that. I was a poor student, so I decided to drop out of college, go to work. I went to work in a steel mill, and then realized shortly thereafter that I better get back into college because I was prime material for the draft for Vietnam was heating up and all of that. And I was a candidate for West Point and the Air Force Academy and all that. And I decided that I was not going to do that. So I knew I was prime material for the draft and did not want to be cannon fodder. So I better go back to school. And if I went back to school, it was going to have to be something that I really would love doing. And that was film. Couldn't afford to go to film school. A friend of mine told me, why don't you just go to this little theater school in Milwaukee, Marquette University. They have a great theater department. And so that's how I got steered into theater. And it was the best thing that ever happened for me in terms of my development as a creative person in media. So I go to this theater school, and it was the kind of place that was not supported by the university, but it was the most popular thing that the university did outside of basketball. Marquette University had a great basketball team, and they had just axed their football team, and the theater department drew the biggest crowds and all of that. And if we didn't sell tickets, then we couldn't buy costumes or lights or whatever for the next production. So it was like being in an off-Broadway theater where you had to survive by the quality of your work. in a university environment. So they didn't have a directing program, and that's what I decided I wanted to do. But in order to be in the theater department, you had to go to ballet class, you had to go to voice class, you had to go to acting class, you had to build sets or costumes or design lights or whatever. And if you didn't do all of that, you were not part of the theater department. So by the time I got to New York, I could do anything, whatever needed to be done. I could act, even though I hated acting. I was a lighting designer, and that's how I got my tuition paid for. And my directing mentor said, if you really want to be a good director, go to New York and act for 5 years. So I'm in New York. I go to an acting class. The guy who's running the acting class is starting a new theater that is designed to encourage writers from other disciplines, journalism, poetry, whatever, to write for theater. It's called the American Place Theater. And he offered me a job as an assistant stage manager or whatever. And because I was there in the mix, they needed an actor to play Frank Langella's manservant. And so I wind up acting in a play off Broadway that wins 5 Obie Awards for the best of everything. Best directing, best acting, best production. It was based on the Amistad incident that Spielberg later made a film about, called Benito Sereno. And so after we get all these accolades for the play, we make a television version of it and we cut a record of it. And so I said, oh, hey, this is not that hard. But I tried to convince the producer to let me direct the next play, because I just knew I could direct better than the English director, Jonathan Miller, who had won all these awards, right? Very cocky young guy, full of piss and vinegar. And he said, well, you have no design, no credits, so directing credits. So you can design the lights. So which I did. And then I eventually, it took me about a year to convince somebody to let me direct the play. And so that's, so being involved in the, once I directed my first play, I got all kinds of great reviews and stuff like that. But then came to New York, put my resume on Douglas Turner Ward's desk, and he was starting a new theater called the Negro Ensemble Company that produced 2 Pulitzer Prize winning playwrights and all kinds of wonderful actors, you know. And that was my first off-Broadway directing job, which I won an Obie Award for Best Directing. And it was a very political, powerful piece written by Peter Weiss, who wrote Marat Sade, and it was called Song of Lusitania Bogey, about the Portuguese oppression of Mozambique and Angola. Can you believe that? And it was a sing-spiel, a song play, where the drama, the words and the music and the choreography and all of that just made a very powerful statement about colonial oppression and slavery, you know. So meanwhile, I'm doing all this theater stuff, but I'm reading everything that I can get my hands on about filmmakers and filmmaking, because that was my ultimate ambition. And my theory was, in college, I'll go to New York, I'll make a reputation as a director in theater, and then somebody will offer me a movie. Very naive kind of collegiate thinking, but that was my mindset at the time. So I get my first Broadway play, and I hire a young actor named Al Pacino.
And the play was Does a Tiger Wear a Necktie, correct?
Exactly. And my wife played the female lead, and I have wonderful actors like Hal Holbrook and just a list of young New York theater trained actors. So the play winds up winning, getting nominated for the Tony Award. I got nominated, my wife got nominated, Al got nominated, Al won, and then that started his film career. And a producer came up to me after one of the performances and said, I have this little movie that I'm making for PBS television. Do you want to direct it? And without batting an eyelash, I said, does a bear shit in the woods? It's like, of course. Give me the script. And he said, well, there's no script. It's based on an off-Broadway play called To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. And here, take the play, read it. You can do whatever you want to do with it. You can visualize it however you wish to. And which was a perfect kind of transition for me coming from theater into film, because it was about Lorraine Hansberry, who is a brilliant young Black female playwright who wrote Raisin in the Sun and The Sign in Sidney Brewstein's Window and Les Blancs, and died at 34, but it was a piece that was cobbled together from all of her writings, the plays, her essays, her speeches, and it painted a picture of who she was and how she came to be. And my job was to film that. So I had great actors who wanted to be involved in quality material. So Ruby Dee was in it, and Claudia McNeil, who was the original mother in Raisin in the Sun, and Roy Scheider before he became Roy Scheider, Blythe Danner and Barbara Berry. I just had wonderful actors, and my wife again. And that play went on to, that film went on to be a classic for PBS and played in their repertory for 5-10 years. But I had a piece of film that I could bring out to the West Coast. And
but let me ask you, you are thriving among the royalties of New York theater. I mean, you had several awards, you're staging Broadway, off-Broadway, you're working with the best actors. Why did you want to go to the West Coast? Why did you want to go to Hollywood?
I really didn't. I hated Hollywood. I hated the West Coast because New York was like the cultural place to be. And the West was like a cultural desert. So I really did not want to go, but I wanted to make film more than I wanted to be in the theater. That was my primary ambition. And so this was now my opportunity to, and then while all of this was happening, the blaxploitation period was happening. Once I got out of college and came into New York, and so I was watching all of these movies being made that I thought I could do better. You know, I I thought I could make a more just a more significant statement or impact on the way people think and the way people view us as a people, because the blaxploitation thing was doing all of the old, you know, the gangsters, the getting over on the man, but it was a very narrow slice of who we are as a people. And I wanted to tell more important stories than that. So it was almost kind of like one of my original theories is if you want to make a difference, you have to get on the battlefield. You have to get where the action is happening. And if you're not in the mix, there's no way that you're going to break in, you know? So I went to get in the mix. And also we had our second son, and I couldn't afford to raise a family in New York on theater money, you know? So I said, I better go convince these guys in Hollywood that I can direct.
And your big breakthrough there was Cooley High. And that is, as you said, you know, it has elements of like an urban youth, you know, of blaxploitation, but it takes the genre into a whole different level of depth, and the characters and the portrayal of the community. And it was and it was actually produced and distributed by a blaxploitation distributor, Sam Arco.
Exactly.
So it's an interesting contest. What did you like about Eric Monte's autobiographical script about Chicago high school kids?
Well, what I liked about Eric Monte was a really good storyteller. He wasn't a good script writer, a screenplay writer. He didn't know how to do that, but he knew how to tell great stories. So what I liked about it was it portrayed the love and camaraderie that these kids had for each other in a way that I hadn't seen on screen before. And I wanted to show kids as they really were, and the great fun that they had in spite of the conditions that they were living in. And also how tragedy intersects with that joie de vivre, that joy of life, you know, and basically because of where they are. So that's what attracted me to the project in the beginning. And I said to the producer when he offered me the script, because the script really wasn't that good, I said, let me meet Eric Monte, sit down with him, and if I can sit down with him and work with him, then I'd love to do the movie. So I spent a month going to his house every day, and we would tell stories. I'd have him tell stories about his growing up. And I had a stenographer who would write everything down. I grew up 90 miles north of where Eric grew up. I grew up in Milwaukee, he grew up in Chicago. So a lot of the stuff that he went through as a kid, so did I, except my best friend didn't get killed, you know? because the Chicago ghetto was really one of the toughest ghettos in the country that even the cops were afraid to go into. And I knew that we could craft a piece that would kind of open a window onto a life and a group of people that hadn't been seen in Hollywood before.
And the film was a big success. It was it made a lot of money compared to, especially compared to its budget, and brought you to a bigger studio attention. I think that it was at Universal that you set up Car Wash,
Right.
which was, again, you know, that's a project that didn't start with you and you changed completely. It's my understanding that it was supposed to be a musical, just kind of like Tommy, and you you changed the old thing and introduced these characters in a much more fleshed out way, and still making a, you know, a wonderful comedy. And
Right.
yeah.
Right. Well, one of the things about Car Wash, when I read the script, I was working on a story about George Jackson and Angela Davis, and it was a love story, and very hard-hitting political, you know. And the success of Cooley High was a blessing and a curse in a way, because it was so successful, and the humor and all of that, and the music, the use of music. People were giving me only one kind of script, and I came out of theater where I was dealing with hard-hitting drama, you know, tough subject matter and all of that. And so I wanted to do Angela Davis story. So I read the script, and it's very funny and humorous and all of that, but it had no depth. It had no lasting value, in my opinion. And so I was talking to Suzanne DePass, who was Berry Gordy's right-hand person and had discovered the Jackson Five, brought them to Berry Gordy's attention. And I was saying, you know, they're offering me this movie, but I'm going to turn it down. And she said, "Are you crazy? It's a Hollywood movie. You know, if it's not what you want, take the job and make it what you want." Some of the best advice I've ever gotten, you know. So I take the job. The guys, the young producers who were doing it were fantastic. They had hired Norman Whitfield, and they asked me in the interview, they said, "Would you mind working with Norman Whitfield?" And I said, "Norman Whitfield, are you crazy? Norman is like the Motown guy. You guys did good. You hired the right person. So yes, I'd love to." But I took the most interesting characters to me were Abdullah, the pseudo revolutionary, you know, the guy who's wants to change the whole system, and Lonnie, the ex-con, and the older guy who had been to jail and done all of that, and was now trying to make his life work right. To me, those two characters, if they could be fleshed out and made real people, and their situations made identifiable and that people could relate to, that the drama of that could underpin all of the fluff, all of the comedy, all of the fun of it. And I saw how well the combination of comedy and drama worked with Cooley High, and how it affected the audience, that I knew that it would work on Car Wash. But the studio hated the idea. They said, no, you can't mix comedy and drama, you know? And so even though I had the job and we were, you know, I convinced them that I had to shoot the film in chronological order. Normally in film, you can't do that. You shoot the scenes where they're most efficiently placed, whether you could start the film with the final scene of the film just because of the location or whatever. But I was having this argument with the studio, and so I knew I needed time to hopefully try to win the argument. And so I said, you know, I'm designing this film kind of like Altman did Nashville, and I'm layering the action behind the action. In sometimes 2 and 3 stories are going on in the frame. So I have to have my actors there every day, all the time, which the actors hated in the beginning. Because they're used to showing up when they have lines to speak. And they don't want to be background actors. So, and that's true today, you know. But I said, no, this has to be an ensemble. I have to have my people there all the time. I have to start at the beginning, and the last day of shooting will be the last scene in the movie. And in the meantime, I'm on the phone arguing with the studio saying, no, the movie has to end with these guys embracing, you know, with the older guy disarming the revolutionary to keep him from destroying his life, you know, and he breaks down in the tears and the studio's going, oh, please don't do this. So that was quite a fun situation to be in. And eventually they just, I started going a day or two over budget, over schedule. And they finally said, Schultz, just finish the film, you know?
I love the irreverence of the film, of your films. They're all irreverent. You know, the comedy is so, it's hard to think that humor could be made today, you know, could be made today, some of the films. Car Wash also marked your first collaboration with Richard Pryor. I mean, we could be talking 3 hours about that, but right. you made 3 films and 1 uncredited with him, right? And I
it's 2 o'clock.
Sorry.
And what can you tell us to give us an idea what it was like working with him and your relationship with him, creatively speaking?
Sure, absolutely. I was brought out to Hollywood from my New York theater work by David Picker, who ran United Artists at the time, and Clarence Avant, who's called the Black Godfather of music here in Hollywood. They wanted to do a film called Simmons from Chicago, and it was about a Black guy from Chicago who becomes president, who happened to be a pimp, right? And they were designing it for Richard Pryor. And so that's how I met Richard, to talk about that project. And then in my naivete, the studio would not give me enough money that I thought was necessary to make a really good film. And so I turned the film down. And I think Richard Pryor, you know, I said, I'm not going to make a blaxploitation kind of piece of garbage. If you don't want to spend the money for it, then you really shouldn't do it. So I think that Richard kind of admired the fact that I would walk away from a potentially, big deal. It's going to be a big Hollywood movie, because he felt the same way. So we kind of vibed on that level. And then I went on to do other things. He went on to do other things. And he had a Western that he had written after after he got screwed out of doing Blazing Saddles. Mel Brooks kind of screwed him. Richard wrote a lot of the comedy stuff, and then he was supposed to play the Cleavon Little part. And then Mel changed his mind. So Richard wrote a real hardcore Western that frightened everybody. It couldn't have gotten made in that period. It was called Black Stranger, but I was trying to get it made. So we had an ongoing kind of relation while we were doing other stuff. And when Car Wash came, I tried to get the original preacher that was modeled after. And it was a New York preacher named Reverend Ike. And Reverend Ike came to lunch at the studio at Universal, and he was tempted for a minute, and then he realized, might not be a good idea to make for myself, So he was the kind of preacher who we got those classic lines from, like, the best way to help the poor is not be one of them, and he would, so after I couldn't get Reverend Ike, I called Richard and said, Richard, I'd love you to, just play this one-day part. And he loved the idea of doing that. Well, the one-day part turned out into a two-day part. But I was also developing what I thought was going to be his first leading man role. And that was the characters that he played in Which Way Is Up. Because after Cooley High, the producer came to me and said, what other movie would you like to make? And I said, I really don't know. So he came back with an idea based on a Lena Wertmuller film.
Seduction of Mimi.
Right. And he said, do you think this could be made into an American film? And I said, oh, absolutely. And the perfect guy to do it, who would be better than Giancarlo Giannini, would be Richard Pryor, And Steve said, who's Richard Pryor? So I said, okay, I have to educate you. So after he met Richard, I was developing that script for his leading man debut on the silver screen. And then while I was doing Car Wash, he decided that he wanted to be like Burt Reynolds. And he took this movie called
Grease Lightning.
Grease Lightning, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I love it. I know it's not one of your favorite, but I love it.
Yeah. Well, I wound up, being enamored with it also, because it was really it was a great story and based on a true character. So by the time I finished Car Wash, in the editing and all of that, he was starting to shoot Grease Lightning. And then the producer and Melvin Van Peebles, who was directing it, had a parting of the ways. And I get this phone call from Richard saying, Michael, would you take over this picture? And I said, oh, no, no. But I didn't want his first leading man film to be a failure. So I took it over and kept as much as I could from Melvin's 5 or 6 days of shooting, um, and then finished the film.
And that was also very successful. I mean,
Mhm.
those films were real very big crossover success.
Right, right.
And
It was very interesting. And one thing I wanted to just talk about quickly, because people don't realize it, is the entertainers like Richard Pryor, and the things that we were doing in that period of time were critically important in terms of bringing together a white audience and a Black audience, because it was so when we did a test screening of Which Way Is Up in St. Louis, and the theater owner, who was an older white guy, kind of chubby and all of that, was breaking out in sweat as he was watching Black theater goers come into his theater, because it had been a segregated theater. And then he'd watch all these white audience coming into the theater, because Richard had that drawing power. He drew from both. And the theater owner is apoplectic, because he just thought this is going to destroy his theater, having a Black audience in there. But the entertainers who were able to bring those crossover audiences, and when it got as big as film, the money that was being generated kind of overtook all of the racial considerations, and it was the real beginning of desegregating the movie houses.
And you yourself, I mean, I remember reading early interviews you gave, and you always said, I don't want to be considered a Black director. I am a director. When since you were very young, you maintained that, and that the films were for everyone. And
Right.
and it's interesting how the studios, clearly, with the money that was coming in, they just let you work. And for Which Way Is Up, beside Richard Pryor, to make the film, you reimagine the Vermeuler piece into the context of the California farmer workers struggle.
Right.
And you brought in the Teatro Campesino to help with for details and for casting and so forth. I mean, that was an incredibly bold decision, and you really gave a lot of the studios a lot to deal with. Can you tell us a little bit about that choice of
Oh, sure. For me, it was easy. I mean, the Ruttenmüller piece dealt with the steel workers in Italy, and although we had a steel industry, it was a different situation. And so we're in California, and what was politically hot at the time was the Cesar Chavez organization of the farm workers, and trying to protect the workers against the big big business farming that was putting a lot of the smaller farmers out of business, and exploiting the workers, which is no new news. And because of my work in the theater, I was still, 1 foot in theater, 1 foot in film. And so I knew these guys. Teatro Campesino was a theater group that would go into the fields and they would perform plays that were politically charged and dealt with the issues that the farm workers were dealing with, you know, and it'd stir up everybody. And it was great to see that kind of energy and revolution in a way of uplifting people who needed to be uplifted, you know. So I decided that would be the platform or the background of the story of the seduction of Mimi, or whatever we called it, I forget.
Which way is up?
Which way is up? And there are also things about climbing the corporate ladder and what some people choose to give up in order to be successful. And there were a lot of themes in that film that I thought needed to be, that we needed to have a conversation about. And then as we developed it, I realized that Richard could play more than one part. Because one of the things that I loved about the early Richard Pryor were all these characters that he would create and inhabit in his record stand-up comedy, you know. And so I said, "Oh, Richard, you could play the bootleg preacher because you've already done that in Car Wash. You know, you could take it a step further, and you could play your own grandpa, your own father, and model it after this character you created called Mudbone, and really, really do Richard Pryor in all three of these characters." So it was great fun to do that film, and Richard had the ball of his life. He loved every minute of making that film.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So if someone has, please send your question in on my chat thing. And in the meantime, I will keep monopolizing it and ask you a question that it has to be generic just because of so many films that it involves so many of films, but music, it's always been had a huge role in your work. I mean, you know,
Right.
from Cooley High, you know, Car Wash was a musical. Then you did Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club, and you know, you work on Def Jam. How would you characterize your relationship with music, and why was it important to you, and how revolutionary was the use you did of it?
Well, I kind of grew up around music. My father was a trumpet player. My uncle was a very famous jazz trumpet player named Harry Sweets Edison. And so there was always music in the house. And growing up, and as soon as I could afford to buy my own systems, I had all the great jazz albums and all of that. And so it was just an important part of my growing up. And so almost without thinking about it, I would just apply it to storytelling. Because in many instances, the music can tell you more than the words. And it automatically makes you feel a certain way. So as a director, when you're designing, making the audience feel a certain way, music is a great tool for doing that in addition to the images or what you put in that frame. So that's all I can really tell you about my relationship to it. It comes very natural. I love to use it to work with. It makes, when I was doing Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was a huge, huge endeavor, with hundreds of people and all kinds of rock stars from different, you know, parts of the music spectrum. Uh, I was never tired at the end of the day because we were constantly hearing great Beatles music, you know? So it's fun to work with. It's a great storytelling instrument. Um, and what else can I say?
Well, I have a question from Jonathan. How was it to work with the Bee Gees?
Yeah, it was very interesting working with the Bee Gees because they were, a lot of those musicians were just not actors, you know, and in a way, working with rappers in film is a lot easier because they seem to be more actor performance oriented than the Bee Gees, for example. So they were a little stiff, wonderful musicians, really nice guys. They hated Peter Frampton. They made his life miserable because he was so successful, you know. Um, and Barry, who is Gibbs, who is still alive, was like the real foundation of the group. Um, and they were all really wonderful guys. And I I don't know how comfortable they ever got being on screen, you know, um, but they were great.
I have a question from Ada. What has changed the most in Hollywood over the last few decades of working there?
What has really changed the most is the technology, the tools that we use. Um, the attitudes haven't changed that much. the the driving force, which is kind of fear of making the wrong decision from the executives on down, it hasn't changed much. Um, the 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 cultural changes that we see come and go. You know, it's like when I first came in, there they were opening the doors for minorities to a degree because there had been all of this social unrest in the streets. So the social pressure made the studios and the unions kind of open their doors a little bit. But as soon as everything was cool and, you know, they felt they had put enough people in place, people of color or women, um, things, those people started to disappear, you know, over the years. And so, so there had to be a new kind of energy, a new push to the studios to say, hey, you know, it's like you're robbing yourself of the talent and the genius of whole groups of people because you have this, you know, narrow idea of what the audience wants and who the audience is, you know. So technology is the biggest change. Um, we've made it, the technology has made the tools of filmmaking a lot more accessible to more people because the cost is lower. Um, so a lot more stories are getting told that Hollywood has been forced to incorporate, to bring in, to distribute, because they see it's always amazing to me. It's like they say, oh, there's a Black audience. Oh, maybe, maybe we should make something that's going to appeal to them. But then that'll disappear. Or they go to the next easiest thing to get a green light from, you know. So if it's action, if it's a big tentpole, if it's whatever it is, it's always, let's do something like this because we know that it's worked because it's worked before. So there's still a paucity of uh, creative courage in Hollywood. So more women are working, which is great. More minorities from every, ethnic group except Native Americans, I think, are working, which is great. And the more that happens, the richer we all become.
I have a question from John. What genre do you want to work in that you have not worked in yet? If that's possible, you have done so much.
Science fiction. Science fiction, and also we're developing an animated piece that is driven by hip hop music, and is kind of like a combination of graffiti, which is an American art form, street form, and anime.
Do you like hip hop? I mean, you did Crash Grove is a film on the very origins of Def Jam, and
Right.
you did it with Russell Simmons and Run DMC, Fat Boys. Did you immediately embrace that music?
I did, because when the two guys brought the idea to me to make a documentary, they brought me a Wall Street Journal article that was talking about the underground rap movement. And we went that night to Long Beach to see a concert. And it happened to be the Jackson 5 were doing their final concert at Dodger Stadium that night. And that had all of the reviews and all of the promotion and all that. And there's this little concert in Long Beach that had all the rappers, Run DMC, Curtis Blow, on and on. And we walk into this arena, and there are 17,000 kids screaming from the rafters, and these groups that I had never heard of, that none of us had ever heard of. And we looked at each other and said, oh, this is not going to be underground for 2 more minutes. This is major. And then I went home, and my sons at the time were like 12 and 14 years old. And I said, hey guys, have you ever heard of Run DMC? Ah! You ever heard of Curtis Blow? Ah! They knew all the lyrics of all of the rappers, that I had never heard of. And so I said, oh, I can't be this old fossil. I got to get with it. And we have to make this movie. So, I went to Warner Brothers, and I told the guy who ran Warner Records, Mo Austin, I said, Mo, they had done Purple Rain with Prince. And I said, and had a huge success, but that was a whole different world. I said, Mo, you haven't heard this music, but I guarantee you in 2 years, your kids are going to be singing it, So he called up the film guys and said, oh, make this movie,
I was thinking that part of your liking of the music, beside wanting to be up to date, was also the performative aspect of the rappers. The music having so much to do with language itself, which brings back to theater.
Well, not only that, but it was like you could see the genius and the creativity of kids who didn't have a band. They didn't have a band. They couldn't afford a band, or the instruments or whatever. But they could afford the turntable and what they were doing to create something from nothing was amazing to me, and I thought that needed to be on screen.
We are very much running out of time because Michael is very, very busy. He's going to start production very soon. So I'm going to give Mary the last question. And the last question is, what are you working on right now?
Oh, I'm about to start a pilot episode of a series called All American, which is on the CW channel, whatever those guys are. It's a high school football story, but now the kids are ready to move on to college. And so the spinoff series is going to be on the college campus environment.
And when are you starting?
I'm already starting. We've been casting all week.
So that means we have to let you go back to work. And Michael, I thank you so much for having done this with us, long distance and in the middle of a busy production. I can't wait to have you at the cinema and to show your films on the big screen.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you again for your support of Sag Harbor.
It's great being here, and I can't wait to see what you're doing in that beautiful location.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Take care.